In this Marvel's Midnight Suns hero video, we're going to be taking a look at Blade. He is one of the first damage-dealing characters you gain in the game. And in this video, we're going to take a look at his cards, his abilities, his passive skill, and how to use him effectively in combat. The first thing I want to talk about with Blade is Bleed and a huge role that it plays in his build. He has a large focus on setting this status effect on enemies, which effectively does damage to them on their turn, and his passive Cold-Blooded even gives him a chance to trigger this when he attacks with any of his attacks hitting enemies, as well as some of his abilities have this as well. Bleed is a bit of a double-edged sword in Midnight Suns because when you kill an enemy, they obviously can't attack you, and the bleed damage that triggers on an enemy's turn doesn't trigger until after they take their action. So even if you set bleed on an enemy, they're going to get to damage one of your party members or attack them first or do some sort of action before that bleed triggers if it would kill them. So even if that bleed is going to kill them, they're still going to get a move first, which could be a bit detrimental. And secondly, the mark status effect in this game makes it so that when you kill an enemy who's been marked with any card that deals damage, you'll gain that card play back whether it's quick or not. However, it doesn't count for environmental effects, and it doesn't count for bleed. So if an enemy is marked and they bleed out on their turn, you won't get an extra card play on the next turn. So it can be kind of negative in that way. There are obviously positives to Bleed. You deal damage, and there is a couple other things that Bleed can do for you that I want to show you as we go through his abilities. So the first card I want to talk about is Make Him Bleed. This is Blade's way of drawing two of his own abilities, but also setting Bleed on the next three attacks that he does, and it also generates heroism. So this is really great for pulling cards like Daywalker into your hand or Strike that can hit multiple enemies and setting Bleed all over. In any given mission, if you're focusing on damage with Blade, this is the card you want to play first in order to get more Blade cards into your hand, as well as be able to set bleeding and generate heroism in order to use your heroic abilities. I will say, however, that it's very difficult to play this card a second time in most missions, and that's because by the time you can play it again, you almost always are in a scenario where you just need to deal outright damage, and you don't have time to draw cards, set up bleeding, and then finish off targets. You'd almost never have that many actions in a turn further on in a mission. So this is a very good card at the beginning of a mission, not so much later on. The next card I want to talk about is Daywalker. This is what I like to use to set and spread bleed all around the board. This is a 3 heroism heroic card. It allows you to hit 4 targets or a combination of however many targets you want. Like you can hit the same target 4 times or one twice and another once, etc. And it allows you to draw a card back on KO, which is kind of counterintuitive because if you're trying to spread bleed around, then you're not really going for kills. Because if you just kill, like, minions that have no health bar, then you'll draw cards, but you won't really apply bleed. So it's kind of a mixed bag. You can use it to kill some minions to get some cards back, and you can also set some bleeding on your priority targets. Or you can just try and spread bleed around, but then you won't get any KOs. And what I really like to do with this ability, when you can modify them, is to apply 1 bleed. So this means that even if you don't have Make 'em Bleed, you're still going to apply bleed to enemies. And why this is important is because you want to use the Hunger ability with this build. And if you don't draw Make 'em Bleed, then you really can't use the Hunger if you don't have this on this card. So this is something a combination you won't be able to do right away until you have applied bleed on this attack or applied bleed on Strike or a chance to apply bleed. But otherwise, you're going to have to rely on Make 'em Bleed. You'll probably want 2 Make 'em Bleeds at the beginning of the game in order to give you a chance to use the Hunger more regularly. So let's talk a little bit about the Hunger. This is a card that's a free play, meaning that it doesn't consume any card played, so you should play it if you have bleed on enemies no matter what. And it's going to mark them, so that means that if you defeat them with any ability, you'll get a card play back, not just quick abilities, which is fantastic because that can help extend your turn because you don't always have quick attacks in your hand. And this will allow him or another hero to finish off enemies with regular attacks or heroic abilities and keep your turn going. So what gets tricky is figuring out with Daywalker, do you want to kill enemies to get cards back or spread out this bleed and then play the Hunger to mark them and then systematically finish them off one by one to keep your whole turn going and to just keep wiping out enemies. It's very, very powerful when you can set up this combo. And because you have applied bleed to Daywalker, if you add that modifier, you don't need Make 'em Bleed, then Daywalker, then the Hunger. And that 3-card combo is really hard to draw all at the same time. But if all you need to do is draw Daywalker and the Hunger, it's a lot easier to pull off. Especially if you kill targets with Daywalker, like let's say you kill 2 targets and then draw 2 cards. One of those could be the Hunger as well, then you can play it immediately afterward. The Hunger is also extremely effective when used with Glaive because this damages enemies in a large AoE and sets bleed on all of them. So if you use that and then cast the Hunger immediately afterward, they're all going to have bleed anyway, whether you used Make 'em Bleed or Daywalker or not. So let's take a look at Glaive. This is the legendary ability of Blade. You need to get to friendship level 5 with him in order to unlock his challenge, complete his challenge, which is rather easy. I have the solution to that at the end of this video, so if you want to see how to do that puzzle, it's there. If you don't, it's fine. And what this does, again, is a huge AoE with pretty good damage, especially if he's been strengthened, that sets bleeding on the enemies in the area so that you can consume the hunger afterward to mark them all if they're still alive, or maybe a bunch of them are dead. You don't even need to. And then you can keep your turn going, or you can use cards like Reaper to just absolutely pound enemies into a pulp if they're still standing. So let's take a look at Reaper. This is the only card in here that I actually have 2 of, and that's because it's so damn strong with this setup. You absolutely should have 2 of them. What this does is it deals damage, it's a regular attack, it generates heroism, it gives you strengthened when you kill an enemy, and it consumes all bleeding on the target that's remaining. So if you hit enemies with bleeding, like if you put Make 'em Bleed, played that card, and then you attack with Daywalker, you're going to put 3 stacks of bleed on an enemy. Consuming all that in one attack almost always kills an enemy, no matter like how tough they are. And obviously more stacks is better. And if you want to get real nasty, if you have Make 'em Bleed played and then you play Daywalker, you can actually hit one enemy many times in a row with Daywalker to stack even more bleed up on them, get up to like 10 stacks, and then hit with this and you can wipe out like 1,000 damage in one attack. It's absolutely devastating, and what I like to put on this card for modifiers is either quick in order to refund it in case, you know, maybe you just draw Make 'em Bleed and you attack with Daywalker and then you just attack with Reaper and you don't actually have the hunger in your hand, so you didn't mark anything. This will allow you to kill a target and still get that card play back, which is great. Or put gaining something back on KO, because you always KO with this card. So maybe you draw some Blade cards or just regular cards when you KO. Both of those are good on this card. And lastly, we have Quick Strike in here. It's not bad to have Quick Strike for the same reason. It's a quick attack that kills enemies. You can modify it to gain strength and to increase his damage, which is great. And it also deals substantially more damage if targets are bleeding. So if you set bleeding with Daywalker and then finish something with Quick Strike, you can deal a lot of damage to like a stronger target. Instead of just using this to wipe out a minion like most classes would use or most heroes, you can actually wipe out tougher enemies because of that extra damage you gain if the target's already bleeding. Characters that I like to pair Blade with are usually Nico or Doctor Strange or Captain America. Nico can buff him with either Strengthened or Fast, Strengthened increasing his damage if he doesn't already have that buff, or Fast reducing the cost of his heroic abilities, and he's got 3 of them here and they're not exactly cheap, so that's really good for him as well. She can also make him draw a card by using that same ability, Blood Magic, which is fantastic, and she can also use a card Double Up that will allow you to draw double the cards. So maybe you have Glaive in your hand and Daywalker, and you cast that. If it comes up heroic, you can draw another copy of each of those, which is phenomenal. Doctor Strange will just generally increase the damage of his abilities and allow you to pull some of those attacks back, like Reaper again, because Reaper is really powerful in this game. So it's just a really good combo with him in order to buff his damage and get cards back. And Captain America just has really good card draw in general with some of his abilities. That allows him to draw a lot of cards that then could be Blade cards in order to play this, because Blade works really well with his own cards. Maybe he doesn't need them as much as some other characters do, but you need to set bleeding and you need to have cards that affect bleeding targets, so that means a lot of his cards. Other characters in your group, you can modify their abilities to set bleeding. That will really help Blade out if you're in his group, so you should consider doing that if you want to have more synergy with other party members, but otherwise you're going to focus mostly on Blade abilities. So that wraps up our Blade video. I hope that gave you some idea of how Blade works in this game. If you have questions, please leave them in the comments. And if you have tips for other players or things I missed, go ahead and post those there. We have the solution to the legendary puzzle for Blade at the end of this, so if you want to keep watching, you can see that as well.